Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Georg Schweitzer and I'm going to present you today New Zealand, the wines of New Zealand, the wine regions of New Zealand and the importance on the international market of wines of New Zealand. New Zealand, even below Australia, is split up in two islands, the North Island and the South Island. And in both islands, wine growing is going on. Actually, in the very north, in the Auckland region, Northland region, there the wine growing has started back some time, 17th, 18th century. Then it goes down on the North Island to the, let's say, crossover to the South Island, where the main concentration of the vineyards is in the New Zealand area, and then going really further south down to central Otago, for example, which is the southest and most coolest region, of course, of New Zealand. Don't forget, we are below the equator, so it's the southern hemisphere. The more south we go, the cooler, the wetter it's going to be. So the Northland, the Auckland, where I just said the wine growing has started, logically, it's the warmest region, and therefore the reason is simply given, it has to be started there. Some key facts about New Zealand. We talk about roughly 40,000 hectares. It's always a comparison with Austria. Austria is about 45,000 hectares. We talk about the same size, although the size has been growing quite a lot. The latitude in Australia, maybe you remember, it's between 30 and 40 degrees of latitude to the south. Here we talk about 35 to 45 to the south, so even more south. The interesting thing here is, if I would just map it up to the northern hemisphere, there are quite important wine regions like Burgundy, for example, or Champagne on this latitude side in the north. But still, the climate down there in New Zealand is cooler and a little bit wetter. The altitude of the vineyards, depending where you are, about 120 to 130, up to 650, even 700 meters above sea height. And the average temperature in New Zealand over the vegetation period, so the period where the wine is growing, we talk about 16.5 degrees of Celsius, which is just enough to get the grapes ripe. The average rainfall is quite high. The lowest, about 600, going up to 1,000, even 1,200, 1,500 sometimes in some years of rain. So this is a huge amount of rain. But you know, if you think about New Zealand, beside kiwi, of course, you talk about green, green, green. New Zealand is the green country. It's all about greenness. It's all about humidity. And this is one of the biggest issues as well for the wine growing, of course. The harvest month of January, the average rain rate there is about 50 millimeters, which is quite normal. This is okay, you can cope with. And we are doing roughly 3.3, sometimes up to 4 million of hectoliters. I made the comparison with Austria in the beginning. With 45,000 hectares, we produce on average 2.4 million hectoliters. Here, with a little bit less area, we produce more wine. So the average yield in New Zealand, and this is generally the case in the New World countries, as all the countries are considered, they have to go over the sea, over the ocean, the average yield is much higher, but delivering the same quality. The major variety in this country, in New Zealand, you name it, it's Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc is an international benchmark from New Zealand. They made a proper style of Sauvignon Blanc, which is, I would say, pungent, distinctive, gooseberries, nettles, sometimes cat pea. Yeah, sorry for that, but this is an official naming for the aromas Sauvignon Blanc can develop from New Zealand. This is the thing with Sauvignon Blanc, so it's a kind of a benchmark. Then, of course, we talk about Chardonnay and we talk about Pinot Noir. Interesting. Pinot Noir, a red wine in a cool country with a high humidity. But think about Burgundy. Burgundy, Pinot Noir is the same story here. So we get really high benchmark quality Pinot Noirs from New Zealand. The big difference compared to the Old World, compared to Burgundy, for example, much more color. So quite often you even get purple dark color on a Pinot Noir, which is not the norm. You got herbal aromas impression. You get a good, decent amount of acidity in there. And the tannins are even heavier, but they are still ripe and smooth, like in the Burgundy region. New Zealand is a growing country in terms of wine. The area back in 2012 was about 35,000 hectares. Now, 21, we talk about 40,000 hectares. So it's increasing steadily, and it's still increasing. It's going on the increase. As we know, the climate change is supporting this increase of area of vineyards, because it's going to be warmer, it's going to be drier, so more places are really relevant for wine growing. If you talk about the total volume of grapes harvested, in Australia as well as in New Zealand, they always talk about tons of grapes crushed. Yeah? So in 21, the tons of grapes crushed has been 370,000 tons. Yeah? This is let's say a decrease of 19% compared to the year before in 2020, mainly due to the climate and due to the weather phenomena in this area. A lot of rain was there, frost was there, so it was really going down. But this year, as the harvest is currently ongoing, we are now in beginning of March, so end of harvest is here. The figures look quite good again. So they think that they go up this 19% again to come on the same level as in the year 2020. Couple of figures in a nutshell of New Zealand. Per capita consumption is just below 20 liters per year. It's a little bit lower than in Australia, where we've got 20.2 per capita consumption. Austria has got 29 liters. Portugal, well above 40. So we are here in a mid-range country, drinking quite good amount of wine. But looking on the share, on the on-trade and off-trade, so on-trade is the share in gastronomy, for example, is with events, yeah? It's still a small portion. So most of the wine is consumed at home, with barbecues and other things, of course, but not so developed the gastronomy, the industry in there. The most important wine regions in New Zealand, I just name a few which are really important. Yeah? One of them on the northern island is a region called Gisborne. Gisborne, roughly 1,200 hectares of size. The climate, high rainfall, high temperatures, and a lot of sunshine. So everything you need to get grapes ripe. The soils are fertile. And this is one of the major issues in New Zealand. Almost all of the soils are fertile. So you have to think about what kind of rootstocks you're using, what kinds of scions, so the Vitis vinifera clones you're using, that you don't get too much grapes on a wine, because it's fertile and the vigor side of the wines is, it's just growing like hell, and you have to really do a proper canopy management, so the green management in the vineyard to cope with this vigor and fertile soils in there. The number one variety in this area, of course, is Chardonnay, a white wine variety, as well as Merlot on the red wine variety, getting a decent, nice, fruity oriented with moderate acidity wines. Sometimes oak barrels used, French oak barrels mostly. There are just a small amount of American oak barrels in New Zealand. In case they do it, it's French, but most of it is stainless steel, temperature controlled fermentation in there, as well as maturing, and quite nice fruity style of wines with a good acidity. In the very beginning, I mentioned about the latitude, 35 to 45 degrees south latitude, comparable with some Burgundy and Champagne and maybe Bordeaux regions or Loire region. In the Northern Hemisphere, the difference between New Zealand and the Old World in terms of wine style is the fruitiness, purity of fruit. The difference between New Zealand and Australia or US, for example, is the higher acidity. So it's really something in between. As said before, Chardonnay, that variety with the highest potential seen there and with the highest plantings, quite aromatic, quite rich palates. Think about French oak, as I said before. Pinot Gris, Sauvignon Blanc, Gewürztraminer. So the aromatics, the aromatic varieties, they are upcoming in New Zealand, interestingly. Gewürztraminer in a style with a little bit of residual sugar in there. So think about Alsace, but with much more fruit and much more cleanness on the wine style, on the taste. And on the red side, as said, Merlot with lots of flavor in there. Another important region on the North Island, Hawke's Bay. Hawke's Bay, as the name is saying, is a bay, so we've got a lot of fertile flatland alluvial soils from the river going in there. So again, we have to consider what kind of rootstocks we are using. The climate, warm and high sunshine hours are there. Slopes, so the vineyards can go up to 500, 600 meters even. The slopes are going up to 1,600 meters. And there's one sub-region which you have to remember. It's called Gimblet Gravels. So the soil type is already part of the name. It's about gravels. And if I think about gravels, I think about either Châteauneuf-du-Pape or I think about Bordeaux. And actually this Hawke's Bay region, you can compare with the Bordeaux from France region in there. Bordeaux style blends are the majority of wines coming from there. Red wines, Cabernet and Merlot. And Merlot, by the way, is the most planted variety in Hawke's Bay. There are single varietal Merlots existing with a lot of fruitiness, a good portion of acidity, but as said, Merlot and Cabernet as a blend, quite a nice trend in Hawke's Bay. On the white side, it's the Chardonnay, it's the Sauvignon Blanc, and the Pinot Gris again. All of them being really fleshy, fruity, bright, refreshing acidity in there. And even the Pinot Gris, when you think about Pinot Grigio from Italy, for example, no taste, no smell, nothing. This Pinot Gris is like an aromatic bomb in comparison to the Italian Pinot Grigio. The most important and most well-known region in New Zealand, it's the northwest part of the South Island. It's Marlborough. Everybody talks about Marlborough. And if you talk about Marlborough, you talk about Sauvignon Blanc. So Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc has been the benchmark and made really the day and the business for wines of New Zealand. And the New Zealand Marketing Organization, New Zealand Wine Growers, as they are called, they really made the really nice hell about Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. Why? It's distinctive, it's fruity, it's pungent. Even if a glass would stand 1.5, 2 meters away from me, I could smell this wine. This is Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. Marlborough region has got the most sunshine hours in New Zealand. The soil types, flat river valley, stony soils with a good drainage and capability to store the heat, the warmth during the day. Irrigation is necessary in this area, and a lot of top quality producers are coming from there. It's the biggest site with 28,000 hectares roughly, so more than half of the area in this New Zealand wine growing region is Marlborough. As said before, Sauvignon Blanc, the #1 variety in Marlborough. And you will see it later on. Sauvignon Blanc is the #1 variety in New Zealand in general. But beside this pungent, pure fruit, herbaceous character, we've got very good Pinot Noir. The smell of this Pinot Noir, the aroma, is about dark cherries, it's about plums. It's got a spicy background, a spicy finish, a mid-weight and fine tannins. As before, aromatics are a hot topic. Riesling, Gewürztraminer, and even Pinot Gris, as said before, is really considered to be aromatic variety. One upcoming thing in New Zealand, and especially in the region of Marlborough, are sparklers. Sparkling wines having used the méthode traditionnelle, so meaning second fermentation in the bottle, with vintage character as well as with house blend character, compared with the champagne. It's quite the same, based on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. They are fresh, fruity, high acidity, and a very fine and lean body. A fruity version of champagne sparklers. That's how I would name it at the end of the day. And the last region I want to mention, because it's one of the upcoming regions for Pinot Noir, it's the southwest region on the South Island. It's called Central Otago. We talk about 1,930 hectares of wines there. It's continental climate, high diurnal swings, so meaning the difference between the day temperature and the night temperature is really, really big. And the vineyards are on slope. Some say wines planted on slopes produce better quality. For whatever reason, this is a separate discussion we're not going to take here, but we can do it if you want to. Discuss about slopes or flatland, what's the better thing. Soil type, sand, slate, limestone, volcanic. So you see a difference in comparison to the other regions there. We've not got gravel, we've got not alluvial soils. We got limestone, we got volcanic soils. Volcanic, quite fertile, yeah, don't forget it. There's a lot of humus in there supporting the growth of the wines. And what Central Otago did is they defined and started to define sub-regions back in 2011. Like in Austria, within Burgenland, you got the Mittelburgenland, you got the Leiterberg, Neusiedlersee, Rosalia and Eisenberg region. The very same goes on here. So concentration of closer origin in getting the quality higher. Main variety in Central Otago, Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir, quite fragrant, quite fruity, a leshy fruit, a taut structure, so it's really binding your mouth. But on the other side, like Pinot Noir is doing, a silky texture. Aromatics are coming up, like Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Chardonnay, and a portion of Sauvignon Blanc is there as well, with a fresh, fruity style and a really, really refreshing acidity down there. In general, if we talk about the climate, from north to south, it's mostly maritime. So again, the comparison with these traditional regions of France, northern Spain, northern Italy, for example, in the Europe region, the North Island is warmer on average than the South Island, logically. In case, I said before, the case of rainfall being really, really high, but the pattern in comparison to Australia is a little bit different. It's the rain spread out over the year and not, like in the harvest time or in the winter time coming there. But still, if you go further south, the rain rate is increasing, and as said in the very beginning, could be even up to 1,500 millimeters of rain there. A lot of different soils, but all of them are fertile. As said before, rootstocks, scions need to be considered. We prefer soils with a good drainage because it's raining quite a lot. So there will not be any problem and any discussion about irrigation there. You don't need it. Yeah? And as to this climate, this high rain rate, these fertile soil types, we need to discuss about the special viticulture practices and good canopy management. And New Zealand is one of the leading countries in research about viticultural practices in the vineyard and good canopy management. They even introduced a special trellis system called Scott Henry, where they split the wine, the shoots of the wine. One part of the shoot is going up and the other part is even going downwards toward the earth, which nobody would ever consider in Europe, for example. But this works, splitting up, having a lot of leaves there, a quite high canopy management amount needed. But with these methods, they really get the grapes ripe with a higher yield on average, as you saw in the figures I presented before. A big problem, of course, fungal diseases. Yeah? What they do against the fungal diseases, cover crop between the rows. So they do a cover crop they save or they store the humidity from the vines, and therefore the pressure on fungal diseases is a little bit limited there. We've got higher yields compared to wine quality, and one scheme, Sustainable Wine Growing New Zealand, is part of the government. So the New Zealand government said New Zealand wine has to be sustainable by 100% by end of 22, maybe 23. Right now they are at the level of 96% being sustainable, but this is the biggest thing they are looking for, and they really support it. There are different ways how you do it, different supportive schemes, financing support, all of this, but sustainability is the key in New Zealand. By the way, the screw cap was invented in New Zealand. Stelvin is a company in New Zealand. They were the first one using this one. But just going a little bit back to the history, I said 17th, 18th century, a little bit of wine growing started with not a huge amount, but the real start, again, it was an Englishman, like in Australia, a Scottish man coming from this Great Britain area, planted the first wines back in 1819. James Busby made the first wine, and what did he do with this wine? He sold it to the British troops being there. They had a lot of thirst, and they were hungry after wine, so it was a good sell for him. Phylloxera happened as well in New Zealand, late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. With this, powdery mildew came in, as well as some other diseases brought in, but powdery mildew is still the most affected problem in New Zealand. What they did in terms of overcoming the phylloxera and overcoming the pressure on diseases, they started to plant American hybrids. Actually, maybe you know this one American hybrid or American grape variety is called Isabella. It's one of the varieties used in Uhudler in Austria. Was really around 1960 planted quite heavily. It had a nickname. It was called Albany Surprise in there. But they started to plant a lot of Müller-Thurgau because for this area, for these growing regions, the rain rate, the humidity factor, it was quite nice. But from 1970 onwards, they started with international grape varieties, especially with Sauvignon Blanc. One interesting thing is about the economy, the sales structure. Are you allowed to sell wine in New Zealand to private people? Until 1881, no. They were not allowed to sell it directly to the public. They had to go via hotels and some liquor stores and things like this. In 1955, specialized wine shops were allowed to sell one bottle, single bottle to one person on a day. Yeah, it's quite nice, and they had to have a license there. In 1960, the restaurants, they were allowed to start selling wine. Bring your own bottle license. So going out for dinner and take your wine with you from home because you're interested in this wine and you want to do this pairing, the food pairing. Yeah, this was introduced just back in 1976. And the supermarkets, they were granted a license for selling their wine back in 1990. So it's not that long time. It's 30 years ago that supermarkets were allowed to sell wine in their shelves. The grape varieties, I briefly mentioned already, by far the number one is Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc takes more than 50% of the area, of the vineyard area out there, and then the rest just followed quite below 10,000 hectares in New Zealand. It's a Chardonnay, it's Pinot Gris, it's Pinot Noir, of course, on the second place, which is really important. And then the rest, a little bit lower amount going down there. But on the rise, you see these aromatics, yeah, like a Gewürztraminer, for example, like Riesling. They are coming up. They are really, really nice what they are doing. And in terms of crush, yeah, of course, Sauvignon Blanc has got the biggest crush and has got the highest average yield as well. So you see, everything has been, or yeah, I have to say, has been concentrated on Sauvignon Blanc. Just recently, they started to concentrate on Pinot Noir as well in terms of marketing. On the white side, Sauvignon Blanc, I don't need to say anything more about this one. Chardonnay on the second place, about 3,000 hectares compared to about 25,000 hectares on Sauvignon Blanc. You see a small portion in there. Classical Sauvignon Blanc style, remember, pungent, distinctive, gooseberry, herbs, grass, tomato, asparagus, usually unoaked. Stainless steel treatment completely. Fermentation temperature about 12 degrees, just to get these tropical hints as well in these wines. A Chardonnay, sometimes you get the oak involvement. If it's oak, then it's a French oak. Upcoming varieties like Pinot Gris and Riesling. On the red side, it's Pinot Noir with about 6,000 hectares, concentrated red fruit character, smooth tannins, high alcohol levels, so 14.5, even sometimes 15 can happen, but still having a decent supporting acidity in there. Merlot and Cabernet, just a little bit, often blended. Think about Hawke's Bay, I mentioned before, and Syrah, upcoming variety on the red side as well in New Zealand. Wine style, there's one thing you have to remember on New Zealand, it's purity of fruit. This is the clear target. Transport the varietal character into the bottle, into the glass. Cool fermentation for white wines to get the fruitiness supported. Complexer wines are done with whole bunch pressing, for example. Even some involvement of stems, tannins in there. New oak, batonnage, you know, this stirring the yeast in the bells, and malolactic fermentation are quite common for complexer wines. In Pinot Noir, they really work on the tannin management to get it smooth, ripe, round, but still a lot of tannin in these wines of Pinot Noir. Acidification, de-acidification, chaptalization, everything is allowed in New Zealand. You can do what you want to do. And talking about screw caps, I said New Zealand has been the inventor for screw caps. 94% of all the wines, red and white, are closed with screw caps in New Zealand. With regard to specific wine terms, it's about the wine law in New Zealand. There was actually the labeling restrictions or the labeling rules up to 2006. For example, saying if you name a variety, then 75% is the limit for naming a variety in there. This has changed in 2006, as well as in accordance with the European talks about exporting wine. So the level is now 85%. If a variety, a vintage, or a region, an origin is named on the label, 85% has to come from there. The rest can be whatever. If there is a blend and you name the varieties on the label, all of them have to be named, which are in the blend, and they have to be named in accordance to their importance in the wine. So the biggest portion, number 1, the second biggest portion, number 2, and so on until the last variety. In 2016, this was even more specified. They got clear rules, dedicated rules, how to name the wines, mainly saying the naming of a wine is not allowed to get some imagination about origins, for example. So you're not allowed anymore to call it white Burgundy, for example, a wine, because this relates to origin, and this is not okay, like in the European Union. They even defined some areas with some special qualities in terms of wine quality and flavor, and this can be registered. So if a certain origin does have a specific flavor, yeah, like let's say bell pepper, yeah, then this can be a distinctive descriptor for this area, for this region. And this can then be in the naming or part of the naming of the label in there. I don't know that much wines doing this, but the tendency is, yeah, on the winery side to make this differentiation to get a little bit more of USPs on their own wines. New Zealand, a small country, not that much inhabitants there. So again, the business here is very much export related. A biggest portion of wine is in the export business. We talk about roughly 1.97 billion New Zealand dollars on the export business. A huge portion goes out there. And if you look on the numbers for packed wine export, yeah, this is much bigger than the unpacked wine export. So we would say export in bottle, this relates to the packed one, and export in bulk, yeah, this relates to the unpacked export. We do about 150, 160 million liters on the bottled export and 130 million liters on the bulk export side, going down in comparison to 2020 as to Corona. Yeah, the COVID-19 situation had a big impact as well. But the average price, look on the average price. Yeah, we talk about on the bulk side, €4 roughly per liter going out, and let's say almost €9 per liter on the bottled side. So the New Zealand dollar is about 0.66. New Zealand dollar is about 0.66 euro. So we have a really high average price. In Austria, the average price per liter is about €3.20, €3.30, which is considered to be high already. New Zealand is even higher than that. And the biggest portion of wine goes to the US. This is growing. US is, since a couple of years, the biggest market in terms of consumption, mainly due to the millennials. They started drinking. You know, legal age being 21, but they now start drinking wine and more alcohol. Great Britain still, Australia, quite important country, as Australia is, by the way, the biggest import country for New Zealand wines, and then Canada and Germany followed closely on this one. The export value, always steady growth rate, except the last year in 21, as said before, Corona was fighting back against the exports and the limits of gastronomy. Everything was closed, and most of the New Zealand wine in the export is consumed in restaurants. So you clearly see the impact on Corona there. One thing which is really, really important to mention when you talk about New Zealand and wine, it's the wine tourism. There are a lot of tourism ongoing. People visiting wineries in New Zealand, enjoy their time there. Yeah? There are different offerings, like tasting, for example, which you can do normally in a winery. But beside this tasting, you got maybe a restaurant where you can have something to eat. You got a ground place for childs where they can play while you are doing your sipping and your tasting of the wines, for example. Almost every winery has got something to offer, and the wine tourism is a big, big thing there. The wine tourist in New Zealand stays on average 6 days longer compared to a normal tourism guy in this area. So this makes a huge impact on the money which is spent on local activities and on the economy of New Zealand. And if you look on the homepage of New Zealand, wine tourism is up there in number 1, number 2 in importance, and there's a lot of things ongoing and nice offerings for almost everybody around the world. Just to name some leading producers from New Zealand, Pernod Ricard, New Zealand, is one of the biggest and most well known in the upper level segment, of course, of the wines. Delegats, another big distributor, especially on Sauvignon Blanc. One very, very well-known state producing huge amount of benchmark wines. It's called Villa Maria. Quite nice, Sauvignon Blanc coming from there, as well as Pinot Noir. Just try their Pinot Noirs. And some Copper's Creek, a bit more on the commercial side. The interesting thing is, and I told you in the very beginning, that wine growing has started in the northern tip of the Northern Island. Almost all of the big wineries, they have their headquarters still in this northern part in the wine region called Auckland. There they process the grapes, even the grapes coming from the South Island. They're brought up and they're processing the grapes there vinifying it and then going to the export and selling the wine. Talking roughly about the labels of wines. So they are like, let's say, limited in terms of information, the front label. All the technical information is normally on the back label. You have to name the volume content of the bottle. You have to name the alcohol. If you talk about alcohol, the local law is again 1.5% up and down. If the wine is going to be exported to Europe, it's 0.5% according to the laws of the European Union. The vintage, again, as said before, 85%, the origin, 85%, but we talk about the name of the winery, really, really important, the grape variety, really important, the origin, important as well, maybe not that much like the grape variety, and then, you can do the vintage in front of the label, but in terms of marketing, it's the producer, which is dominant on the label, and it's the variety. So we are clearly on varietal-based marketing in the transition to a little bit of origin-based marketing going on. On the back label, on the technical label, all the recommendations are there for, drinking habits, how much you should drink, what's good, what's sustainable, how much calories, for example, you have. You have these warnings about when you're pregnant, you should not drink. Everything is there. Almost all of the bottles, they do have this ISBN code for scanning, coding. And what's always nice is there's a storytelling on the back label. Why the wine tastes like it tastes, where does it come from, what's the story behind, is there any specifics on this wine? It's all told on the bottle, which is nice to read from a consumer point of view, and you get a little bit more insight into the wine and have some ideas when you drink this wine. It's all about storytelling at the end of the day, and New Zealand is doing really, really well on this one. So that's in a nutshell what I want to talk about New Zealand, just to give you an idea about the North Island, the South Island, the Sauvignon Blanc from there, their industry structure, and as they are very much related to the export business, more of half of the amount of wine produced is going into the export. They are a major player in the export market, not in terms of volume, because they cannot produce that much, but in terms of value they deliver, quality they deliver, and benchmark styles. Thanks a lot for listening and enjoy your glass of New Zealand wine. Thank you. Bye-bye.